Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. Today's video, part of the Simplified opening series, will deal with the Closed Sicilian. I got this request by some of you guys, subscribers, in the comments, and while I was sure that I have done a video on the Closed Sicilian earlier, I couldn't really find it, and then I realized that that was actually article from my newsletter where I was describing the problems I had with the Closed Sicilian when I was a kid. And those problems with the Closed Sicilian came from the simple fact that I had nobody to tell me a sentence or two that would have solved everything and dispelled all doubts I had about the Closed Sicilian. So yes, the Closed Sicilian is pretty simple opening to play against. And in today's video, I would like to show you a system that is not the mainstream one, but one that I think is obviously less well known, but also that is probably underestimated by the white players. So let's get going. E4, C5, knight C3. And already on move 2, black needs to decide how to play already, because in most of the cases the second move for black will depend on the choice of an open Sicilian black has on his repertoire. So for example, we get a lot of Najdorf players here play the move d6, still hoping for some sort of transposition after, let's say, knight f3 or knight g2 followed by d4, or the move a6 with similar ideas, playing the Najdorf move a6 and then hoping for a transposition. However, my practice and experience has shown that this almost never happens. And when white plays knight c3, they don't want to play an open Sicilian. So to me then, playing a6 or d6 just gives an additional some additional options to white. For example, after d6, the move d4 is an interesting option that has gained some popularity, and it was introduced in modern play by Magnus Carlsen. So I think for black, while he should have in mind the possible transposition to an open Sicilian, this is not very likely to happen. So in this video, I will concentrate on two moves. One is knight c6 and the other one is the move e6. And already by mentioning the move e6, you probably get the idea that I won't be recommending the standard way of playing against the Closed Sicilian, which, just to remind you, goes something like knight c6, let's say g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, let's say d3, d6, and then black plays either e6 or e5, then knight comes to e7 or to f6, rook b8, b5, b4, and so forth. Now this is well established, obviously it's pretty good for black, but that's not what I'm going to recommend, because if you look at it, it is the main system for black against the Closed Sicilian, and the white player will likely have already a good way or a line prepared against it. So before entering the let's say the variations of what I'm going to suggest, I need to point out that there is only one move here for black that does not allow a transposition to any open Sicilian, and that move is the move knight c6. So in fact, this is the move that the lines I'm going to show which prevent the transposition to an open Sicilian. This is the move that I recommended in my Chessable course on the anti-Sicilians. And I found it pretty practical, because black doesn't really need to know or doesn't need to care about a possible transposition to the open Sicilian, and can just play this system independently, directly targeting the white's choice over Closed Sicilian. So we will start with the move knight c6. I will briefly mention the prevention lines that black has against the possible transposition to an open Sicilian, but I will mostly concentrate here on the move bishop b5, which is the only additional option that white has in addition to the standard move of playing the Closed Sicilian with g3. So before embarking on bishop b5, let's just check two moves, which is knight g2 and knight f3, where white still threatens d4. So after knight g2, white threatens d4, and now unless your preferred open Sicilian is a Taimanov, 4 knights or similar, where you can play e6 and then likely transpose to the lines we will look at after g3, or after d4 you get your favorite anti-Sicilian. The move to stop an open Sicilian is the move e5. Obviously, if you play the classical or the Sveshnikov, you can also play knight f6. Yeah? But here, like I said, I'm also making this all-encompassing for all Sicilian players, including Najdorf players. So the move to stop d4 is the move, obviously, e5. So now there will never happen a move like d4. So white normally plays knight d5, and what happens is that the knights are exchanged here. Let's say knight f6, knight ec3, take on d5, take on d5, d6, bishop c4, bishop e7, and it may look that white is pretty well placed with this control of the light squares, but in fact black is fine, because he can quickly play the move bishop g5 and exchange his passive dark squared bishop. So let's say d3, castles, castles, and bishop g5. And without the dark squared bishops, black does not have any bad or passive pieces, and this control over the d5 square and the light square control for white amounts to very little. Add to that black can also contest the light squares with moves like bishop e6, knight e7 later on, and further exchanges will mean that white has very little in this position. Similar, we're going back, similar is the move knight f3, threatening d4, and again, I will just mention, if you play the classical Sicilian, you can go with d6. If you play the Sveshnikov, you can go knight f6, but this also includes some bishop b5 ideas against the Rossolimo. If you play the Taimanov, you can go e6, or the 4 knights, you can go e6. So again, I'm stressing this, depending on your choice of open Sicilian, you can choose different move orders. If we look at the possible transpositions, we could say that what I'm recommending in this video is best suited, let's say, for players of the 4 knights or Taimanov after e6, even though bishop b5 would be some sort of a Rossolimo. But like I said, all Sicilian players can play this, because there is no need to allow an open Sicilian, and black prevents it by playing e5 again. So again, we have this same structure with black surrendering control over the d5 square, but in return obtaining control over the d4 square. So bishop c4. And now, again, I won't go too much into details. I will briefly mention that this position is possible to play in 2 ways. Two plans, main plans. One is the standard one, let's say d6, bishop e7, knight f6, short castle, and so forth. And the other one I'll briefly show you here is the one I like a bit better, which is the one Carlsen used on more than one occasion, and that starts with the move g6. Now, if you want to explore the other one, the other plan, d6, knight f6, and so forth, I would recommend checking the game Svidler-Carlsen, which a brilliant game by Carlsen, where he won against Peter Svidler using the maneuver knight d7, knight b6. So check that one game if you want to explore this plan in greater depth. Very nice game. I used it as a basis for my repertoire on Chessable. But g6 is very nice, because if white is simply, let's say, doing nothing, black will develop bishop g7, knight g7, short castle, then h6 and king h7, and then with f5 he'll just start attack on the king side. So long term, black has this plan of expanding on the king side. Now, if white knows what he's doing, he will not allow this lightly. But still, this is a nice long-term plan for black. So let's say d3, already threatening knight g5, because the bishop controls the g5 square, so knight g5 would attack f7, so h6 is played. And now there are quite a few games played in this line. Carlsen has played it several times, and the most, let's say, famous game after which this line became popular is the game against Nepomniachtchi from Zagreb 2019. You can find that game in the database. And I will just generally outline that black's plan is obviously to go bishop g7, knight g7, d6, short castle, and then king h7 and f5 if allowed. Yeah. So check the games by Carlsen in this line, playing with black, and you should be fine navigating the middle game. So this is a slightly, I wouldn't say offbeat, but still less common plan than the usual d6, knight f6, and bishop e7. So now that we have covered the possible attempts by white to transpose to an open Sicilian with knight f3 or knight g2, we will explore the main alternative to the closed Sicilian with g3, which is the move bishop b5. Please note that the Grand Prix attack with f4, I will cover it via the second e6 move order after e6. So this will be covered after e6, as will be g3. So g3, e6, we will have a transposition to the lines after second move, e6. So let's check bishop b5. And here by far let's say the main move and most likely the best move is the move knight d4, avoiding a possible capture on c6, and this has its own theory, which you're more than welcome to check. But in this video, I would like to give you a shortcut solution, and that shortcut solution was somewhat surprising to me because I didn't even know it existed, to be honest, and I just discovered it while I was preparing the material for this video. Before embarking on it, I would just also like to show you one other idea, and it starts with the move e6. But the thing with e6 is that it's not considered very good for black, because it allows this bishop c6, bc6, and now d3, when white is allegedly better placed than the usual Rossolimo, where the knight is already on f3, because white can actually go f4 and knight f3 then. But what I found is that this is not as simple or as straightforward or as good for white as it's normally considered, because if black knows what they are doing, then black actually manages to achieve some counterplay. And that black what should do is that he should be very quick by playing d5 immediately, and then following up with the idea like bishop a6 and c4. So this is the key idea for black in these structures, not allowing white to be quick to establish positional grip. So let's say f4, bishop a6, knight f3, and now either c4 immediately or queen b6 followed by c4. And black manages to open the position somewhat to give life to his light squared bishop, and is not doing that badly at all. So e6 is interesting, even though here you have to bear in mind that after knight f3 we have a transposition to the Rossolimo, where after the usual moves e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, e6, white has played the move knight c3, which currently is not the most popular one, because normally white either takes on c6 or castles, but it's a possible one. So this is a line that you should check if you want to go e6. But now let's go back to my shortcut solution, and that starts with the move again, e5. So what we have is the same idea of giving up the d5 square but controlling d4, but lines here become a bit sharper and concrete. On the positive side, this is a virtually unknown line, and a line that is not very likely to be known by your opponent. So I think it has some sort of surprise value. Now the idea of e5 is that this positional threat of taking on c6 after bishop c6, dc6 is not very well founded now, exactly thanks to that pawn on e5. The reason is that f4 is more difficult to achieve, for one, and second is that the bishop, the black still being undeveloped, he can develop the pieces bishop d6, knight e7, and knight g6. And this is the ideal setup in this structure, e5, c5, c6. The ideal setup for black, because if white is passive, so you will notice that the knight from g6 and the bishop on d6 control the f4 square and don't allow for a possible f4. The pawns on e5 and c5 control the d4 square, so there is no d4, and white is basically devoid of active pawn breaks, whereas black, thanks to the two bishops, bishop on d6 and bishop c8, if allowed, will go maybe even long castle and then prepare f5 and start play on the king side. So positionally speaking, this is a good transformation for black. That is why after e5, white should refrain from taking on c6 and should play d3. And now again, there are a few moves. For example, a few players can play the move knight d4. While possible, it leads to some complications, and I didn't find them too convincing for black. So I explored something else, and this is already, we are entering this unknown territory with the move a6. So it's a funny thing because black is insisting on white taking on c6, even with a loss of tempo. So a6 is pretty useless in this position, but the positional trumps that black gains, as I explained, control over the dark squares, the ability to develop bishop d6, knight d7, knight g6, and so forth, outweigh the loss of tempo with a6. So this is still fine for black. Therefore, after a6, white should play bishop c4 and now b5. And now again, I'm telling you, this is virgin territory, and you should do your homework to explore this. I will show you the main lines, but some things will need to be checked if you like to play this. And obviously the bishop is attacked. There are two possible ways. One is to go to d5, one is the other one to go to b3, so we explore both. So bishop d5 is met by knight g7, threatening to take on d5, but also probably inserting b4 first, attacking the knight that covers the bishop on d5. So white should be fast, therefore, with f4. If the bishop retreats now to b3, knight d4, yeah, I'm still going after that bishop, then bishop b7, d5 can happen, black is fine. So f4, b4. Now if the knight moves, then knight d5, so bishop c6, knight c6, knight d5, and now d6. And now the key idea again for black is to get rid of this knight on d5. So knight f3, knight e7. So you see, this is it looks a bit unnatural, you would say, but when you check with an engine, you realize that black is perfectly fine. So let's say castles, take on d5, e5, and bishop e7. Yeah, and black is fine, pair of bishops. This pawn doesn't really hang because after capturing, the pawn on d5 will hang and the opposition will open for the pair of bishops. So if e5, d5, knight d5, probably just castle, defending the f7 pawn, and then the queen d5 is threatened, but also bishop d6, queen h4, and so forth. So good compensation in that case, or simply regaining the pawn. So black is generally fine. So this is the, I mean, again, if it looks a bit strange to you, it is. But this is the price you have to pay when you're exploring these moves that are not mainstream, that are a bit risky, but you get the pros and cons. The pro is that you are avoiding mainstream theory, you are getting your opponent into a territory where you know more, but on the other hand, you are obliged to play precise move, exact move, sometimes even strange looking moves to maintain objective quality of your moves. So let's go back to the position after b5 and check bishop b3. Now knight f6, natural developing move, and now knight ge2. Yeah? There is also f4, which should be met by bishop b7. It's a nice line, I can show you. So f4, bishop b7, knight f3, and now bishop d6. Again, interesting development, but the idea is in controlling the dark squares. So the bishop and the knight both control e5, but also the d4 square. And if f5 now, it's not too scary because black hasn't castled, so there is no imminent threat of a pawn storm with g4 and g5. But why I'm showing you this line is because black has a very nice way to obtain counterplay by a pawn sacrifice with c4. Attacking the bishop on b3, d takes c4, and now bishop b4. So the threat is to take on c3, after bc3, e4 would hang. So cb5, ab5, castles, bishop c3, bc3, and now queen b6 check, king h1, and now queen c7. It's just a consolidating move. This pawn is not necessary to take it immediately because it just opens the e-file, for example, or something like queen e1 or so on. And also there are ideas like knight a5, not so much going after the bishop, but maybe plonking a knight on c4, opening the bishop to attack the pawn on e4, and black has very nice positional compensation here. So let's go back, and instead of f4, let's check knight g2, bishop b7 again, short castle, and knight d4. So now we see the idea of the bishop being on b7, and that is controlling the d5 square. f4 now. There are other moves like taking on, let's say, on d4 when black should recapture with the e pawn, and after knight e2, bishop e7, the idea is to continue with d5. Yeah, so castles d5 and black should be fine. The line continues, you can check it, but black is fine at the end of it. So f4 instead, and now again the same development, bishop d6. Yeah. Knight g3, intending possibly knight f5 or knight h5, and queen c7. And this is a nice move because it just increases black's control over the dark squares. And if you look at it, black really has very good development. The knights are well placed, the bishops are well placed, the queen is well placed, good central control, d5 is covered. Yeah, so it's even visually black is doing fine. There is also an alternative, you can castle and not fear any attack after f5, because after take on b3, a b3, b4, knight b1, bishop e7, d5 is coming, and black obtains active play in the center. But I think queen c7 is more flexible, keeping the king in the center. And after knight h5, some sharp play happens after c4. And the lines here become very sharp. Yeah, there is knight f6, there is knight g7. Again, I'll show you a few lines. Let's say knight f6, gf6, dc4, bc4, bishop a4, and rook g8. And it's clear that black is doing fine. Yeah, pair of bishops, good knight, rook is active. The king can go to e7, it can go long castle. It's more than fine. Yeah. The lines after knight g7 are also quite interesting. King e7. And here, in fact, white is running a risk because he needs to sacrifice a piece. He does obtain compensation, but after the forcing line, knight h5, queen h5, cb3, f takes e5, bishop takes e5, queen f7, king d6, bishop g5, again the only move, and rook a e8. So again, very strange position. Black is a piece up, the king is centralized on d6, but thanks to these all well-placed pieces, white doesn't really have an attack, even though it is still a bit uncomfortable for black to navigate the position. Maybe king b6, king c5, king b6, king is a7 happens, and black then wins thanks to the extra piece. Yeah, but objectively at this point it's pretty unclear. And the third move, I checked, d takes c4, and now not b takes c4 because f takes e5, bishop takes e5, check on g7, king f8, bishop h6, and this is winning for white. So not that, but eliminate the knight first. Knight h5, after dc4, queen h5, and now again there is a choice. Again, the threat obviously for white is to take on e5 and take on f7, so no time to take on c4, so either e takes f4 or short castle. Yeah. There is one spectacular line I'm going to show you after e takes f4. So before that, let's just check short castle, f5, and simply f6. Yeah, stopping f6 and not fearing checks because cb5 check, knight takes b3, cb3, ab5. Obviously, black has very good compensation. The pawn on b5 is taboo. Knight b5, queen b6 is a check, and the knight falls. And otherwise, black has excellent compensation. b4. The e4 pawn is hanging, there is a play along the a file, play along the c file, bishop c5 can happen, and so forth. And white has really nothing on the king side. But now the spectacular line I promised, e takes f4, knight d5, bishop d5, queen d5. Yeah, the rook is attacked, and there are threats like c5 or some cb, and then queen f7, and now queen c5. An amazing move, sacrificing both rooks. Yeah. So queen a8, king e7, queen h8, and now again, I'm not going to show you the alternatives, you can check them yourself. What follows is strictly the only way for both sides, but note that actually it is white who is risking getting mated if he doesn't play the correct move. So knight e2 check first, king h8, knight g3 now, hg, queen h5. So white is two rooks and a bishop up, but he's fighting badly not to get mated. King g1, bishop c5 check. Now bishop e3 is the only move, not rook f2, because fg3. Yeah? So bishop e3 first. Now bishop e3, rook f2, f takes g3, queen g7. So now white is creating some counterplay, but he needed to give one rook back, g takes f2, actually both rooks back, king f1, check on h1, king e2, queen takes a1. Now there are threats like f1 queen or queen e1 or so forth, not d1 but e1. And now it is actually white who needs to give the perpetual, queen e5, king d8, queen b8, king e7, and black cannot avoid the perpetual. So fantastic line where white is walking a thin rope not to get mated. So this is the analysis of this rare but I think quite exciting and very unexplored line after bishop b5. So let's go back to the starting position after bishop b5 and based on this move e5. So if you like this stuff, you can just take this analysis as a starting point and then explore further. So now we switch to the move e6. Like I said, I will explore it. I will explore these two move orders, knight c6 and e6. But after knight c6, you can always transpose to e6, unless white plays bishop b5 or attempts one of these knight moves to f3 or e2, intending an open Sicilian. So like I said, now knight f3 would likely lead to an open Sicilian, and you will have to have your open Sicilian lines refreshed. But I will look at other options here, most notably the Grand Prix attack with f4 and the Closed Sicilian with g3. One more move worth noting is that, let's say, knight g2, knight c6. Again, d4 is an open Sicilian, which can happen also at a later stage. Let's say g3, knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e7, and now d4, for example. Yeah. cd4, knight d4, castles. But this, I think, the Scheveningen version with d6 is better. It's good for black, not having wasted queen move on queen c7 or a6 like in the Taimanov, for example. And black wants to go bishop d7 here. Just a quick note. Yeah. Another move that's not quite open Sicilian, but neither is a closed Sicilian, is the immediate d4, cd4, queen d4, knight c6, queen e3. And now there is more than one move for black how to play this. You can go for d6, can go for a6 and b5. Here I have just looked at the most direct way of playing, knight f6 and followed by d5, so bishop d2, and again there are options like h5, even d6, bishop e7, but just d5 directly is fine and the most straightforward. e5, knight d5, knight d5, queen d5, and knight f3, bishop c5, and followed by castle, and black is obviously doing fine. Note that the queen on d5 makes it more problematic for white to castle long, because then the pawn on a2 is hanging. So just a quick mention of this relatively rare move, d4. So let's go to the Grand Prix attack with f4, and now knight c6. Yeah. And an interesting move I would like to mention here, the main move, okay, by far is the move d5, and that's perfectly fine. You can check it, and it gives black really easy and straightforward play. One idea that I would like to note about for black is that in the positions, let's say after bishop b5 check, bishop d7, let's say it takes on d7, queen d7, knight f3, knight c6, yeah, d3. There is one interesting idea, which is d4, knight e2, f5, stopping f5 ideas for white. And another one is knight g7 and then going g6 when with some sort of Grand Prix attack, but with the light squared bishops exchanged. Another idea after knight c6, castles d4. I would like to show you this structure, which happens after the exchange of pawns on e4 and d5. Knight e4, bishop e7, d3. And now the idea I wanted to mention is the move knight h6. Yeah, so in this structure, this move knight h6 is quite interesting because the knight comes to f5 and black obtains a perfect grip over the d4 square. And generally speaking, these structures are very pleasant for black because landing a knight on d4 is quite unpleasant for white because c3 is never really an option, because that obviously weakens the pawn on d3. So just have in mind this idea, knight h6. So d5 obviously is a possible move, but the move I wanted to mention is knight e7. Again, a strange one. And the idea is after knight f3, knight ec6, g3, going for the closed Sicilian. This line with knight d4, bishop g2, knight c6, d3, and bishop e7 is actually fantastic for black. So very peculiar knight maneuver, and establishing a knight on d4. And then black just goes short castle, let's say d6, and plays a closed Sicilian with knights already established in the center. Rook b8, b5, b4. The bishop can come to the long diagonal, and black has excellent play. So bear in mind this peculiar idea with knight e7. Yeah, you can also check it. But as I said, knight c6 is what I want to explore. Knight f3, and now knight g7. And the idea with knight g7 is in fact similar to the move I mentioned, knight e7 earlier, because after g3, black goes knight d4, bishop g2, knight ec6, short castle, bishop e7. So I just gave you two possible move orders, how to establish this knight connection, let's say knight c6, knight d4 in the center. The only way white can, let's say, prevent this from happening, note that the Grand Prix attack move bishop b5 doesn't really work because of a6 and bishop c6, knight c6. White achieved nothing. So the only way for white to stop this is to go d4, to transpose to some sort of an open Sicilian. But after cd4, knight d4, knight d4, queen d4, knight c6, queen f2. Again, there is more than one way for black to play. Bishop e7 or bishop b4. But again, I looked at the move d5, which is the most direct one. And now white chooses the structure. e5, for example, bishop d7 is very good for black. Rook is coming to c8. Queen is coming to a5 with very strong counterplay on the queen side. There will be all sorts of threats, d4, bishop b4, and so forth. So ed5 is another option. Black gets an IQP, but very easy play. Bishop comes to b4, can take on c3, queen can come to a5. Again, it's a good version for black, also because white has also weakened his position with the move f4. And the third move, bishop d3, keeping the tension in the center, but now d4, knight b1, knight b4. So at some point, black can exchange that bishop, obtain the pair of bishops, and well, have a good position. Let's say short castle, bishop c5, knight d2, short castle. Yeah? So black can time the capture on d3, perhaps waiting for white to waste the tempo with a3. And b6, bishop b7 can be played. Later, when the bishop is no longer on d3, f5 will be an option to open the long diagonal for the bishop on b7. So after, let's say, knight c6, e6, the Grand Prix attack can be dealt with this idea, interesting idea, let's say with knight e7, followed by knight d4, and so forth. So that's the interesting idea against the Grand Prix. I think quite surprising. So what now we have remaining is the closed Sicilian with g3. Again, knight c6, even though d5 is a perfectly fine move, which you can use via the e6 move order. But we are sticking to knight c6, bishop g2, knight f6, d3, and bishop e7. And this is the setup I'm recommending. It's not very common one. Knight f6, bishop e7. Like I mentioned at the beginning, black usually fianchettos the dark squared bishop, but not here. And here, there is actually only one thing you need to know about this position. And well, again, I wish somebody told me this when I was little. So the one thing you need to know about this position is the following. The moment white plays f4, you react with d5. And that's it. We will see what this means in practice. Let's say knight g2, castles. Now, if white waits, castles, you can go d6 and play f4, d5, even with a loss of tempo, but no need. You can still go rook b8 and prepare the standard play rook b5, b4, and waiting for f4, d5. Yeah. We will explore what happens here. After ed5, you can take ed5 or knight d5. This is a welcome change in the structure because white, as I said, weakened the king side with the move f4. Whereas after e5, knight d7, we will explore this also a bit later on. Okay, there are two plans. One is to undermine the center with f6, and the other one is simply to continue with the advance on the queen side and basically waiting for white to start with g4 and then play f6, as white has weakened the king side structure. So very few things to know about successfully playing this line. Let's say f4 here, d5, and again e5, knight d7, castles. Again, two options, waiting for g4 or even playing f6 immediately. Yeah. The point is, after f6 is that e takes f6, knight f6. The knight is pretty bad on e2, and black has really easy play. Bishop d6, bishop d7, then either going e5, depending if this pawn is hanging or not, yeah, or simply going rook b8, b5 before getting rid of the knight and then pushing e5 in the center, expanding. So very simple, straightforward play. So this is the plan with the knight being on e2. We should also check what happens after if white plays f4 and knight f3, but you already know the rule of thumb. The moment white plays f4, black reacts with d5. Now white should push e5 because knight f3 gives black a choice to push d4, which is fine, or simply take on e4. d4, d4, queen d1, knight d1, and b6 with a pleasant endgame. Bishop comes to b7 or a6, long castle maybe can happen. Rook is coming to the d file. Knight d4 is always an option. So this is more than fine for black. So e5 should be played, knight d7 and knight f3. So now we have a different placement of the white knight on f3, where it's better than on e2 because it controls the e5 square. So castles, castles, and now rook b8. Like I said, f6 is also possible, but the difference is that after ef6, knight f6, the knight being on f3 can jump to e5. This is still fine for black after bishop d6. Let's say rook e1, a6, controlling the b5 square, intending queen c7, bishop d7, rook e8, and at some point just taking on e5 if white manages to hold that stronghold. So this is also possible. But the more, let's say, okay, one more thing is if bishop h3, not to be worried, yeah, then black can simply just close everything on the king side with f5, then go rook b8, b5, b4, bishop b7, maybe at some point d4 to open the long diagonal. No attack on the king side, black is fine. But like I said, black can be more ambitious and wait for white's g4, so rook b8, and simply preparing b5, b4 and advance on the queen side. Yeah. So let's say king h1, some generally useful move, but b5 is happening. Yeah. Intending b4, knight e2, avoiding b4 in due time, but now another important idea, when the knight is on e2, d4. Why now? Because now the knight cannot access the e4 square. And now bishop b7, yeah, knight b6 maybe, knight d5, establishing a beautiful knight on d5 with great play. And the final thing, you remember, waiting for g4 to hit back with f6. As now with g4, f4, white's king side structure is more loose. So there we have it. Yeah, this concludes our analysis of this system, or let's say a bunch of systems, yeah, against the Closed Sicilian. We've covered quite a bit. We've covered the knight c3 bishop b5 line, quite popular with this rare move e5, and also I think this system with e6, knight f6, which is not that well explored or expected by players who play the Closed Sicilian. I think it should give you pretty good practical chances. So thanks for watching. I hope you liked this one. Like I said, okay, as I always say at the end of my videos, I do my smash that subscribe button. Give me your opinions in the comments. Subscribe to my Substack. You can see the link above my head. And the thing that I recently introduced, if you become a paid subscriber on my Substack, you have the right to text me directly via the Substack app and tell me basically what you want analyzed in my next video. It can be an opening variation, it can be your game or a bunch of games to tell you what I think about your style, your weaknesses, strengths, and so forth. So you can take advantage of that offer. So just head to my Substack and check the options for an upgrade to a paid version. So guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon. Take care.